Welcome back to Trackpad's Living History. Today we're joined by Dr. Jonathan Rich, author of A Convenient Villain, a book that takes a fresh, deeply researched look at Charles Lindbergh, a figure remembered as both an American hero and lasting controversy. Drawing on extensive archival work and a careful reconstruction of period context, Dr. Rich challenges familiar truisms and asks what we get wrong when we flatten complicated people into easy narratives. Dr. Rich, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So tell us something about yourself. How did you get started and why Charles Lindbergh?
So I'm a cardiologist. I'm on faculty at Johns Hopkins Medical School. And during the pandemic, I read a biography of his that won the Pulitzer Prize. And I realized that some things were missing. And before I went to medical school, I was an aerospace engineer. I worked for the Navy. I designed airplanes that fought in combat in the first Gulf War. And I realized that the engineering component of the story was missing. And this is a problem because you can't write about a figure if you don't understand what they did. So in the future, when they write history books about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the authors should actually have to understand what a computer does and how it works in order to write their legacy. So I realized that the 3 trips that Lindbergh made to Nazi Germany between 1936 and 1938 were not understood, that the historians were simply glossing over what he did, why he did it, and what information he obtained. So I tried to write a magazine article, but I couldn't condense it to 1,500 words. So I decided I would write a book. The more I wrote about Lindbergh, the more I realized that this man accomplished some remarkable things, including in medicine. He had an 11th grade education, yet he made 2 major advances to American medicine. And I've been doing this for 35 years, and I've published some papers, but I've done nothing the equivalent of what he accomplished. And also being Jewish and being actually an active Jew who keeps kosher and speaks fluent Hebrew, I thought the narrative that he was an anti-Semite was just facile. And as I did more research, it became apparent to me that there was an effort among historians to perpetuate a narrative without the evidence to back it up, and that the real villains of the era were not being identified. So I decided to write my own book. Took me 3 years. I had to go to New Haven to go through his papers. I went to Minnesota to see his childhood home. I've been to Missouri to the Missouri Historical Society to see all of his mementos and all of his documents. And after doing that, I wrote this book.
Well, and interesting too, right? Because you get in modern, I think it's like a gloss, the Instagram gloss of everything we do today, right? Whereas a lot of times authors or YouTubers, they'll try to find something that's controversial and make it more than it is. And of course, well, Charles Lindbergh was a Nazi. Here's why, because he visited Nazi Germany, right? And instead of actually doing the research, but you've done the research.
Yes. So on October 18th, 1938, the Germans let Charles Lindbergh fly the premier airplane of the era, which was the Me-109. It was the most advanced fighter airplane of its era. And in the book I read that won the Pulitzer Prize, and I'll never win the Pulitzer Prize, and I'm not criticizing the author, he covers this in one sentence. And my thought was, one sentence? This is the greatest espionage coup in American history. Our enemy let an American fly the premier fighter, and not just see it, not just get the blueprints of it, but actually fly it. And I was curious how Andrew Scott Berg, the author, missed this. And I went and paid $6 on eBay to get a copy of Lindbergh's journal, which has been in press since 1970. And I read the entry for October 18th, 1938, and I understood why Berg missed it, because it's written in jargon. It's written in aerospace jargon. And as an engineer, I understood what Lindbergh was saying. And what he was saying was, this is an incredible aircraft. This may be the best airplane I ever flew. And then I followed his actions. Comes back to the United States, April 1939, visits manufacturers of airplanes on his own dime. And I'm following the story, and I can see the lineage between his visit to the airplanes that fought World War II. But I don't think historians have been able to follow this lineage because I don't think they have the background.
Well, in a lot of cases too, like the ME-109 was famous. I mean, it caused an enormous amount of casualties with our bomber
Right.
force, right? It was
Right.
very agile, and it was used all the way through the end of the war.
Yes.
And what you're saying too is this is another thing that people get wrong. Oh, poof! In 1944, we came up with the P-51 Mustang.
Right.
Well, that's not how it happened, right? The P-51 Mustang was in development for years. Do you think a lot of that, like you saw with the P-47, the P-51, the P-38, mostly in the Pacific Theater, do you think if any of those were genesis around, you think his visit is?
Yes. So you got to get down to the component, and the component is the engine. There's a lot of components to airplanes. I designed wings. I designed gas tanks of engines of airplanes, but it's the engine that determines what an airplane can do. It's an engine that determines the strategy. How fast can it fly? How long can it stay in the air? And how agile is it? Now, in 1938, when Lindbergh visits Nazi Germany for the last time, the United States Army Air Corps, we don't have an Air Force till 1941, has contracts for an inferior engine type called the air-cooled engine. Okay, in 1936, they had a contract for a liquid-cooled engine. They canceled the contract because it was a primitive engine and it wasn't reliable. When Lindbergh comes back to the United States in April 1939, the first place he goes, now they send him on these dog and pony shows. He meets the president, he meets the Secretary of War, but the first place he goes on his own volition is to a manufacturer of engines in Indianapolis called the Allison Motor Corporation. In 1938, the Allison Motor Corporation was making 8 engines a month only for the Navy. The Army had no interest. The Army's supply of engines was coming from 2 or 3 companies, and according to them, those 3 companies had a monopoly. So this company has been completely cut out of the airplane engine industry. Lindbergh visits the factory. He visits the factory, sees the capacity of the factory, and says, your capacity is too small. No other company can make a liquid-cooled engine in the amount of time that it needs to do it. If we are going to win this war, you are going to make the engines that are going to win this war. May 1939, that company begins to triple the size of its factory. Question, where did they get the money from? They have no contract. They have no contract from the Army. Where did they get the money from? Well, they got it from a bank. Why would a bank loan them money when they have no contract? Well, because Lindbergh is backing them. So Lindbergh enables the Allison Motor Corporation to borrow the money to triple the size of their factory. June 1941, the War Department gives the Allison Motor Corporation a $200 million contract. They can already make 1,000 engines a month. They went from making 8 engines a month before Lindbergh visited them to 1,000 engines a month when the War Department gives them a contract. When we enter the war, they can make 1,700 engines a month. Okay, that enables us to fight the Germans. That enables us to fight the Japanese. We couldn't fight them otherwise. We would have had obsolete engines, and we wouldn't have had the capacity to build the engines we need. This is something that historians have missed because airplane engines are alien to them. They don't know. I tried to write a chapter on economics. I tried to write a chapter on Germany's economic. I can't do it. I'm not an economist. I don't have the background. I don't understand what I'm writing about. They can't write about airplane engines. They don't understand what they're writing about. But this is just one of many critical contributions that Lindbergh made to the war effort that haven't been recognized.
Well, and that's typical, right? You see, especially some historians gloss over the things they don't understand, but they also gloss over the things that if you're in the field, you know it's important. For example, I was an armor officer in the Army. If you ask me the most important thing that I had to deal with, it was gas and bullets. It had nothing to do with combat tactics, right? You know, the tank is fantastic, the crews are fantastic, the training is fantastic, but it uses 400 gallons of gas every 8 hours. Yeah. Right. You know what I mean? That you got to be very good with the logistics part of the train to be successful. And you think about things like this, right? You're right. The engine is the core of any airplane. I mean, look at the British Spitfire. It was famous because of its engine, right? Look at the P-51 because of its engine, right? You know, and you look at these Allison engines. What were they used for later on? What frames did they go into?
So the Allison V1710 powered 60% of our fighter planes in World War II.
Wow.
Now the other 40%, so your listeners are going to go, okay, well, so what? The other 40% could have supplied the rest. But those engines don't appear until 1944. When you say 60% of the engines between 1941 and 1944, it's 100% of the engines in our fighter planes. You know, the P-51 has a better engine because we have engineers working and developing better engines over the course of the war. But initially, the Allison V1710
is the engine. And the interesting thing is, if in my book there's a table that compares the Jumo 211, which was the German engine that Lindbergh watched being manufactured, and the Allison V1710, and they're very, very similar engines in terms of, the stroke, displacement, the bore, all the things that we use to describe engines. The engines are very, very similar. Now, I don't know that the Allison V1710 was designed to look like a Jumo 211, but clearly Lindbergh's got some influence there. Same thing with safety, the safety equipment inside of our airplanes. In the Kilner report, which the Army Air Corps puts out June 1939, it says, we are going to copy the safety features of the ME-109. Well, who was the only American who had sat in the cockpit of an ME-109? Charles Lindbergh. How do they know what safety features are in the cockpit of an ME-109? Only because Lindbergh told them. So don't just think about how many pilots' lives were saved because the engines were combat equivalent. Think about how many were saved by the safety equipment. The egress to parachute out, or the oxygen equipment that existed in these airplanes, that the pilots didn't lose consciousness. His contribution to World War II is not only incalculable, it just hasn't been documented.
Well, and you see also, compared to like the Japanese style, which was, they eschewed almost every type of safety equipment, right? Because it was honorable death, right? That was key to, that was their whole thing about it, right? Whereas Americans were like, we need to live to fight another day, and if you keep that core of people alive, right, you know what I mean, then your fighting force is more effective later on in the war. Whereas the Japanese pretty much spent all their effective fighting force at the beginning, all the way through midway and a little after, and they just couldn't replace them.
Well,
right?
They also ran out of fuel. Was the other problem, was they didn't have
True.
fuel. So another contribution Lindbergh makes is pilot training. Okay, so he goes 1936 on his first visit. He visits German pilot training facilities. And he writes in these intelligence reports, and these intelligence reports are public record. I've met people who don't believe me. They don't believe these were intelligence missions. But you can do what I did. You can go on eBay and you can buy these things. It's not secret. I didn't see them in some archive somewhere. So the report from November 1st, 1937, Lindbergh's intelligence report, goes over German training, and he points out the deficiencies in German pilot training. And one of the big deficiencies is what you mentioned, that once a pilot was trained, he just fought until he died. Basically, he flew combat missions until somebody shot him down. Americans did not arrange our pilot that way. The men flew 50 combat missions, and then they became instructors. And Lindbergh points out you can't train pilots without qualified instructors. And the Germans are using them up, and they don't have qualified instructors because they keep flying them. In the Battle of Britain in 1940, the reason Hitler turns his aggression away from England to Russia is that he's running out of pilots. So he can make planes as fast as he wants. He's got an unlimited supply of fuel. What he can't do is train pilots fast enough. And Goering is using up pilots so quickly that Hitler has to stop the Battle of Britain. And that essentially is the turning point in the war. A, Germany can be defeated. B, England is going to survive. Okay, C, Hitler's now going to attack Russia. And so that changes the war, is German deficiencies in pilot training, which is another one of Lindbergh's undocumented contributions to the war effort.
And it's just how we treated our people. Like, to give you an example, like, look at the navies. And again, I keep going back to Japan. I apologize. But in Japan, the air wing was integrated to the carrier. It belonged to the carrier. There was no rotating the air wing out. American air wings were not attached to the carrier. They flew with the carrier, came back, swapped out. The carrier could go right back out after a refit and be right combat ready with a brand new set of squadrons. Whereas the Japanese could never do that. When they're if they lost an incredible amount of pilots, then that carrier was essentially, it just wasn't effective at that time. And you see that in a lot of the other militaries. Well, I mean, obviously Britain didn't have a choice at the beginning, right? They had to fly until they died. But
I'm glad you brought up Japan, because this is something interesting for your viewers. There was no Japanese Lindbergh. We had nobody visiting Japanese military facilities in the 1930s. We did not know anything about the Zero. Look what happens with the Japanese. First of all, they surprise us at Pearl Harbor, wipe out our fleet. Okay, then the Philippines. December 8th, 1941, the next day, the Japanese attack MacArthur in the Philippines. He has 277 combat aircraft. In a week, they're gone. They're completely wiped out. Why? Well, first of all, Lindbergh had no respect for the Japanese. He had no respect for their pilots. They were 200 miles away in Formosa, and he didn't think anything of it. Second, they had all of our planes parked in a line. Those 277 airplanes were parked in a straight line. You know, if there had been a Japanese Lindbergh, that first couple months of the war would have certainly gone a lot better. The loss of the Philippines was the biggest military defeat in American history, based on casualties and POWs. It was our biggest loss in the history of the United States.
Oh, and we knew it was going to happen. That's the worst part. At least you could say with Pearl Harbor, it was literally a surprise. Like, we didn't believe they had the capability of refueling at sea. We didn't think they could do that. It wasn't even a realm of possibility, right?
Because our intelligence was so bad.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why we didn't think they could do it, because we had no intelligence on them. Yeah. And of course they were Japanese, so you know they were treated with the same.
There was a racial bias for sure. There was absolutely racial bias. But what the horrible thing about the Philippines was we literally knew that was going to happen.
Right.
And it was going to happen.
And he had all his planes wiped out in a couple of days because he didn't take the Japanese seriously, because there was no Lindbergh to tell him to take the Japanese seriously. On the other hand, we knew everything there was to know about the Luftwaffe because of Lindbergh. We knew what planes they developed. We knew their range. We knew their payload. We knew where their bases were. We knew how many pilots were assigned to each squadron. We knew how many backup pilots. We knew how they got their fuel, all because of Lindbergh. November 1939, the U.S. Embassy in Berlin is kicked out. They give the Army a list of every single Luftwaffe base, every single Luftwaffe unit, every single airplane factory, every single airplane parts factory, all because of what Lindbergh did between 36 and 38.
And you have a society too where you had the first war 25 years just right before it, right? World War I, where we fought the Germans. And of course, coming back to the States, America, 20 years, it was all about Europe, right? You know what I mean? It was fighting in Europe. That's what my dad did. That's what all this happened. Japan was never a thought. And you're absolutely right. Everybody dismissed Japan. And, of course, that's what happened. But, at least, so why do you call him a convenient villain? Why the title?
So in 1939, September 15th, 1939, Charles Lindbergh gives his first isolationist speech. He gets national radio time, and he talks about why we shouldn't enter World War II. Now, remember, on September 1st, 1939, World War II begins, and Roosevelt goes on the radio and says, we're not going to enter the war unless we're attacked. So they're not diametrically opposed at this point. Neither one wants to enter the war.
Right.
October 15th, 1939, Lindbergh gives a second radio address, and he gives the 4 reasons why the United States should not enter World War II. And this is fascinating, okay? Number 1, because if we defeat Germany, Russia will dominate Europe. That happened. Number 2, the English will run up a huge debt. That happened. They didn't pay off their debt till 2010. He'd been dead. Lindbergh had been dead for a quarter of a century by the time the English pay off their debt. Number 3, there will be a famine in Europe after the war. There was a terrible famine in Europe after the war. And number 4, and this is fascinating, this man was truly prescient. If we enter this war, we will never be able to extricate ourselves from European affairs. And that's exactly what happened. People say, well, Lindbergh was an anti-Semite, he was a Nazi sympathizer, but the reasons he gave came true. Okay, instead of arguing with him, instead of debating him, all his critics did was call him names. Because nobody could deny that a war would kill a lot of Americans. No one could deny that. No one could deny, the ramifications of a war that Lindbergh pointed out. So instead, they just called him names. And in that respect, he was a convenient villain, because I don't know that Roosevelt wanted to enter the war, but Roosevelt did want to help England, and Lindbergh did not. And that was really the conflict between 1939 and December 7th, 1941. Are we going to supply England with weapons? And then are we going to supply the Soviet Union with weapons, which Lindbergh had been to the Soviet Union 3 times. Americans were getting a very distorted message of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The Soviet Union was the favorite of a lot of reporters, and a lot of reporters actively suppressed news of what was going on in the Soviet Union, the famines, the show trials. It was all suppressed by the American media. But Lindbergh had seen it, and Lindbergh wasn't buying it. And Lindbergh knew, and a lot of people in the American Foreign Service knew, that the Soviet Union was really evil. Americans didn't really want to hear that when they were our allies. And that was, I'm Jewish. And obviously, I don't like Hitler and I don't like Nazi Germany. But if you ask who was worse, Stalin or Hitler, it just depends on whose ox is being gored. I mean, if you're Ukrainian, then Stalin was worse. If you're Jewish, then Hitler was worse. But neither one was intrinsically better than the other one. They were both evil. We made an alliance with the Soviet Union because it was in our interest to do so. And I'm glad we did. And we won the war. And I'm glad we won the war. And it ended the Holocaust. And that's all true. But from his perspective in 1939, saying the Soviet Union is not better than Nazi Germany, that's a perfectly valid point. I don't disagree with him on that. I don't think either one was intrinsically better than the other.
Well, and Stalin, and people, again, this is the gloss over, right, that happens. Like Mao is the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century by far. Like, not even close, right? And then you get Stalin, who, I mean, kneecapped his own military by the pogroms that he committed right before the war started, you know, and everybody kind of forgets conveniently that he was okay with Germany as long as they were both together taking over Poland and committing.
Yeah, he signed the non-aggression pact.
Yeah. He was a mass murderer.
The communists in the United States, and there were a lot of communists in the United States in the 1930s, supported that. They supported Hitler during the period when Stalin had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. They were not uniformly against Nazi Germany. They were only uniformly against Nazi Germany when it was the enemy of the Soviet Union. There were very few people who were consistently opposed to Nazi Germany. I mean, Winston Churchill was certainly the one that comes to mind, who never, ever gave any countenance to negotiating with Hitler. But most public figures in the 1930s, if they weren't Jewish, at one point or another, even Harry Truman, recommended negotiating with Hitler, forming an agreement with Hitler, dealing with Hitler, until he violates the non-aggression pact in 1941. And everybody realizes there's just absolutely no way you can negotiate with this guy. This guy is not going to keep any agreement he signs.
Well, and again, World War I had this effect on the United States. It's just not our problem, right?
Yes.
We sent a bunch of men over there and they died horribly in trenches for a European war that didn't affect America at all. It
was worse than that. It was much worse than that. If you were 18 years old in France in 1914, there was something like a 60% chance you were dead by 1918. For an Englishman, it was like a 50%. For a German, it was like a 40% chance. It wiped out an entire generation of people.
Especially the French. Yeah.
Yes. We sacrificed 116,000 men in World War I, plus twice that injured. So if you add that up, that's about 500,000 men. Remember, we only had 80 million people at the end of World War I. So that's like, 0.5%. That's 1 out of every 200 people in the United States have been killed in World War I. Everybody knew somebody who had either been killed or badly injured in World War I. Even I know somebody. I had a great uncle, my grandmother's brother, who was gassed in World War I. And I was a kid and he was an old man, but I remember him. So everybody knew somebody who had been killed in World War I. The idea that the Germans were evil was alien to a lot of Americans in the 1930s. They remembered that England dragged us into a war, cost us 500,000 men. And what happened? Well, they got their colonial empire got bigger. They got Palestine, they got Iraq, they got Cyprus, they got a lot of territory that they didn't control before World War I. So this is what we sacrificed 116,000 people for? To build England a bigger empire? To steal more resources from people? In 1939, the English were ruling over 500 million people. Not one of them had given their consent. Not one of them agreed to that arrangement. To the Americans in the 1930s, the idea that England was good and Germany was bad was not something that was readily apparent to them. There was a handful of people who'd had to teach the American people that this was different. The Germans were not the potato famine. The Germans were not colonial India. The Germans were a level of evil that no white person had ever seen. Now, it's been seen in Africa. Africans had been treated pretty brutally by the Dutch and the Belgians and the French. But white people had never seen this kind of brutality before. And that transformation is what Lindbergh talks about during his talks, and it's one of the reasons that he's called an anti-Semite.
Well, and we look at it today, and people may have that opinion, but you're right. At the time, that was a large population of the U.S. Even the Oppenheimer movie. People watch the Oppenheimer movie and they're surprised, like, how could you be a communist at the time? Well, it was egalitarian. You know, it's very sorry, you know what I mean? It was very academic at the time. Oh, it's the smart people choice, right? Because this is the way everybody should be, and this is it. And they kind of forget it. I mean, I think at one point, isn't it the vice president of the United States under Roosevelt, before he picked Truman the second time, they couldn't even trust him because
Henry
he
Wallace,
was having.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, they thought, and when he runs for president in 1948, he's infiltrated by communists. His campaign director is a communist. So this idea of fascism being evil, a lot of people, including Lindbergh, saw Italy, they saw Germany, they didn't understand the economics of it. All they saw was it was better than what was going on in the United States.
It's another European war. Yeah.
Right. So in the 1930s in the United States, not only were there 3 million displaced people, but there was a lot of starvation, there was a lot of malnutrition. And Eleanor Roosevelt had a friend named Lorena Hickok who goes out to South Dakota and Nebraska to see what's going on. And she comes back and gives a report to Eleanor Roosevelt, we should never have settled the West. Things are so bad in these states that we should have just left them alone. Pellagra, scurvy, hookworm, diseases that I have not seen as a pediatrician in my practice, other than when I go to third world countries to do missionary trips, were present in the United States in massive numbers. Why did millions of children not go to school in the 1930s? Because you can't concentrate when you have scurvy. You have no energy when you have these. That's how bad things were in the United States in the 1930s. They go to Germany, they go to Italy, and they see a society where everybody's got a job. They see a society where everybody's clothed. They see a society with lots of pageantry and a lot of edifices. And what they don't understand is that either they stole the money from the Jews or they borrowed it from a bank. And if you borrow it, you got to pay it back. And the only way to pay it back is to have a war, because you need assets to pay back loans. And if you don't have them in your country, you got to go take them from somebody else. And a lot of people don't understand the economics of what they're witnessing. All they can see is that fascism seems to be a better society than democracy. Lindbergh was one of those people who thought that the future of the world was some kind of fascism. But that doesn't mean that he was an anti-Semite, because Italy didn't oppress their Jews the way Germany did. And he saw Italy. And he said, well, why can't Germany just behave like Italy? And not understanding that anti-Semitism was part and parcel and an integral component of Nazi Germany was something that a lot of figures in the 1930s didn't appreciate.
We didn't see the evil of Goebbels and people like that at the time. We did not. So
we didn't. And a lot of that was press censorship, and including the Roosevelt administration, which suppressed a lot of reports or didn't believe them, got intelligence reports and refused to believe them. And that's another reason that Lindbergh is a convenient villain, because there's a lot of blame to go around here, including the Roosevelt administration. It's just easier to blame Lindbergh.
Well, and for the longest time under Roosevelt, it was he did not want to get in the war. He was not going to get in the war. And I like it when I see like people with conspiracy theories like, oh, he arranged Pearl Harbor. I'm like, no, this man did not want to go to war. I mean,
I don't have a problem with historians who want to write a book about that. It's intellectually honest. I mean, they have their sources. They tell you what their sources are. They tell you their information. It's just not convincing. That's all. I'm just not convinced. Roosevelt did not want to enter the war, and for that he does get some credit. If we'd entered the war too early, remember, we had fewer men in uniform on December 7th, 1941 than the English got out of Dunkirk.
Oh, yeah.
I think they evacuated like 400,000 men at Dunkirk. Our army was smaller than that. Mm-hmm. So if Roosevelt enters the war before we're ready to enter the war, we're going to lose the war. And then we'd be living in the age of fascism today. So you give him some credit. He had very good political instincts. He had very good military instincts. And he got things passed. I mean, Woodrow Wilson fought World War I by fiat. Sedition Act, arrest everybody. Espionage Act, arrest everybody. Roosevelt got the Lend-Lease Act through Congress. He rescinded the Neutrality Acts by acts of Congress. He was not a tyrant. He was less of a tyrant than Woodrow Wilson or Abraham Lincoln when they had their wars to fight. You got to give him credit for that.
Oh, no, absolutely. It was his leadership that won that war.
Yeah, he was an outstanding leader. And although I consider him the villain as far as the Jews are concerned, I do give him credit. He was a great president.
Well, and he knew politics too, because look at MacArthur's defeat. I mean, it was 100% Douglas MacArthur's fault that we lost the Philippines like we did. 100%. And he ends up giving him the Medal of Honor because he understands politically that we can't have a loser 4-star in the Pacific. He's the only person that kept that man's career alive. And it was only for that reason alone. I am definitely not a Douglas MacArthur fan, if you can't see that one right there. But like, he understood the politics. He knew how the United States worked, and he did. You're right. He eased us into it. And then Japan was just the catalyst and gave us everything we needed. I mean, isolationism died on December 8th.
Yes. Lindbergh writes in his journal, I want to fight in this war. I'm 42 years old. I don't have to fight in this war. I want to fight in this war.
Yeah.
They all disband on December 8th, 1941. They all disband. All the isolationist organizations disband. There was still, like Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father, is still advocating that Roosevelt sign a separate peace treaty with Hitler. But he does that for his own selfish reasons, because he's got 2 adult children and he doesn't want them to fight in a war. And in the end, one gets killed, and he also loses a son-in-law. And John F. Kennedy is badly injured in the Pacific. But other than that, very few of the isolationists continue to say that there's anything other than an international war that we need to win.
So what does Charles Lindbergh do during the war? What is his role in the war? Because you said he didn't want to join, but he did join, right?
Right. So we can't skip over isolation, and we got 2 years of isolationism to talk about before we get to the war.
Oh, sorry. Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
So Lindbergh gives 18 national speeches. He's got 20 written, but 2 are canceled because we're attacked on December 7th. So I've read all the speeches, and I think one of the credits I've gotten from book reviewers is that I did do that. I didn't just focus on one sentence or one speech. I reviewed his entire record as an isolationist. On September 11th, 1941, Charles Lindbergh gives a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, in which he talks about the Jews. And it's this speech and this speech only upon which his legacy as an anti-Semite is based. And so as a Jewish American whose mother was an historian, when I start to read the book, I think, well, he's an anti-Semite, but maybe I'll feel sorry for him because of what happened to his son. That was my thought when I started reading the book. When I read the speech, I realize that he's an anti-Semite to divert attention from Roosevelt. What he says in the speech on September 11th, 1941 is essentially true. It's not completely true. No political speech is ever completely true. It's exaggerated. All political speech is exaggerated. But what he says about American Jews is true, and not only that, we should have owned it. Basically, what he says is, you want the United States to enter World War II. To which our response is, you're damn right we do. Why shouldn't we? We're American citizens. We have the same rights you do. Why shouldn't we want our government to do what's in our interest? That's a right guaranteed us in the Constitution.
True.
And then he said there are certain powerful American Jews with influence, who are using their influence to affect foreign policy. And he's right again. But what he also does that his critics do not ever acknowledge is he says the Jews have that right. And that is antithetical to anti-Semitism. No anti-Semite ever said that we had the right to advocate for ourselves. We're always involved in a conspiracy or a plot or something. But Lindbergh says they have this right, and I understand why it's in their interest, and I don't blame them for advocating what's in their interest. Persecution in Germany is real. And if you don't believe it, then you have no sense of dignity, which is remarkable that he's admonishing his own supporters. Because there are millions of isolationists who believe that it's all a media conspiracy, that Jews aren't really being persecuted in Germany, including Joseph Kennedy, again, who believes this isn't true. But is what is in the interest of 3 million Americans in the interest of 130 million Americans who aren't Jewish? And that's a perfectly legitimate political question, and it isn't anti-Semitism. And the response is to answer him, not to call him an anti-Semite. And that's why he's a convenient villain, because it's just much, much easier to not read what he said, to not acknowledge that a lot of it was philo-Semitic, but rather just to say that, look, he said the Jews wanted us to enter World War II, therefore he's an anti-Semite, but we did want to enter World War II. That was one of our major priorities. Our major priority was to get the Jews out of Europe, but nobody tells Lindbergh that. Nobody says to Lindbergh, look, if we enter World War II, we can't get the Jews out of Germany. Therefore, if the United States acts in good faith to get the Jews out of Germany according to the immigration laws that already exist, we will not want to enter World War II. Remember, there's 3 million displaced Americans who have no medical care. There's hundreds of thousands of professionals, Jewish professionals in Europe, doctors, dentists, pharmacists, scientists. Right. Like, all these famous scientists are in Europe, doctors. Why not bring them here to treat the Okies? Why not bring them here to provide medical care to these people who during the Dust Bowl have no medical care, who are dying of preventable diseases like pellagra or scurvy? Why not bring them here? Lindbergh would have agreed, I believe. Did nobody know because nobody said anything to him. No one brought it up. But he did recruit scientists. At many stages of his life, he recruits scientists from Europe, and he doesn't know whether they're Jewish or not. He doesn't care. Okay, there's engineers for the airplanes, for the rockets. There's doctors because he was doing these medical advances. He gets lab technicians out. He gets a lot of professional people out of Europe. If somebody had said to him, we don't want to enter World War II. What we want is that there's 40,000 German Jewish physicians who can't practice. We want them to get exit visas. He would have been all for it, in my opinion. And that's really a big part of my book is the idea that a post-Six-Day War generation of Jews who did not grow up as immigrants, who did not have parents who were immigrants, who were not self-conscious about being an American, to say, look, we had the right to fight for what we believed. And Lindbergh acknowledged that, and we should have engaged with him. And that story hasn't been told.
So, and that's true today, right? Everybody, yes. every group, whether it's racially identified or not, has an agenda. And that's just American politics. Yes. And it's real easy for someone else to call someone else a name instead of debating them, debating their merits of it, right? And I'm sure that obviously hadn't changed in the world. That's not a new thing, right? People are like, "Oh, that's just the modern." Like, no, we've been doing that all the way.
So there's a word in German, verboten. Now, if you look it up on Google Translate, it'll say forbidden. But when used in English, verboten has a different connotation. It's something that can't be said. So it's verboten to talk about politics at the Thanksgiving table. It's verboten to ask your son's girlfriend about her past sexual history. It's not forbidden. You're not going to go to jail. They're not going to arrest you. You just don't do it.
It's impolitic.
It's right. In the 1930s, it was verboten to mention the Jews. It was just not allowed. But that wasn't in our interest. We should have been included in. Why? When is it ever in any group's interest to not be included in the national debate? When you read the criticism of Lindbergh, it's almost all by non-Jews because the Jews didn't say anything. It's all, how dare he mention the Jews? But that's not criticism. We needed to be included in the debate. We were about to be exterminated. What harm did Lindbergh do? Who did he hurt? He didn't hurt anybody. So what was wrong with bringing it up? I realized that my grandparents' generation was terrified, just in general, just all the time. And that Lindbergh made it worse. And maybe that's inexcusable, and I'll criticize him for that. But there was no anti-Semitism from Lindbergh's speech. Lindbergh's speech didn't result in any violence. Nobody did anything. It was just that he was turned into this villain. And I don't think that that's right. I think that not just his First Amendment right, but the right of every American before we enter a war to say, should we enter the war? Was certainly his priority, his prerogative. He certainly could say that.
Oh, and I think, going back, and I won't get into modern politics, but, Congress caused this problem with the War Powers Act. Before that, that was not the way we entered war, right? World War II is not, the president could not just invade a country,
right,
the day before, right? It was a deliberate process where we knew what was going to happen and people had to make decisions. Congress, they caused that problem themselves, right? But back then, you're right. We had to have a declaration of war. Even Japan attacking us did not mean we were at war, right?
Right.
He didn't say we were at war. That's
Woodrow
not what
Wilson
said. Yeah.
Goes to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, and asks for a declaration of war. Right. Why? Because ships were being sunk in the Atlantic. The same thing was happening in 1941. Lindbergh sees. There's no other reference. Nobody knows the Japanese are going to attack us, right? So everybody in 1941 thinks that the Germans are going to sink a ship, an American ship, and we're going to go to war because that's what happened in World War I. And on September 4th, 1941, a week before his speech in Des Moines, it happened. The Germans shot a torpedo at an American ship called the Greer. They missed. Historians think they missed on purpose because the Greer was tracking the submarine for a British bomber that was going to destroy it. So Lindbergh sees this fake casus belli, this fraudulent casus belli, where we're going to declare war on Germany because they're firing at our ships when they have no choice but to fire at our ships because we're violating the Constitution and we're actively engaging in a war without Congress's approval.
Which was true.
Which
absolutely
was true.
were.
They
were guarding British convoys and all in name only without attacking a submarine.
Right.
They were doing everything else. Yeah.
So he sees this as the way we're getting into World War II. Everybody sees this. We have no other reference. And he's saying, you have no idea how strong the Germans are. You have no idea how many casualties we're going to experience. And if we don't discuss the reasons why we're entering this war now, you're going to see terrible anti-Semitism when the casualty reports start coming back. People are going to blame the Jews that we entered World War II and we lost. And that's his motivation for giving the speech. It's not anti-Semitic, it's philo-Semitic. He's trying to protect us. Now, it's condescending. We don't need him to protect us, okay? But he's not motivated by anti-Semitism. He's motivated by philo-Semitism. And if you don't believe me, you can buy his wife's journal because Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote a very good journal called War Within and Without, and it's available. It's in press. You can go buy it, and you can read what she writes about her husband writing the speech. So it's not hindsight. She doesn't write it after he gives the speech. She writes it before he gives the speech. This is why he's going to say this. And that's simply been missed for 80 years, that he was not an anti-Semite. He may have said some stupid things. He may have phrased it badly. But we all have hindsight. We all have 20/20 hindsight. We can all go back and say he should have said this, he should have said that. But he was not motivated by anti-Semitism. He was motivated by trying to protect us from an anti-Semitic backlash.
And he didn't know about the final solution. Nobody
knows.
Nobody knows.
Very good point. The Germans haven't even decided on it. Okay, so he knows the Jews are being mistreated in Germany. And he acknowledges it, but he doesn't know anything about the Holocaust. The Germans don't decide to do this till January 1942. It's something called the Wannsee Conference. They start building concentration camps in the summer of 1942. Our intelligence starts getting reports that they're building these camps. The State Department dismisses it because they're anti-Semites. Roosevelt starts to get reports in the fall of 1942. The papers start publishing in November of 1942, are the first newspaper reports about the concentration camps. If Lindbergh had known there would have been concentration camps, would he have changed his advocacy? There's no way to know. But you have to keep that in mind when you judge him. He didn't know what was going to happen.
Well, no one knew.
No one could have even comprehended it.
It's exactly it. Who would have thought, oh, they're going to slaughter 6 million people because of a religion? That's not even, you're an American. That's not even a thought you would have had in 1940, 41, right? You know what I mean? And I don't even think people believed it. There may have been news reports, but I don't think they believed it until soldiers took over concentration camps and the pictures came.
That's a good segue to your last question. What did he do during the war? That's a very good segue because he visits a concentration camp on his own time in 1945. So 1941, we enter the war. He's blackballed because of Roosevelt. He can't get a job. He's on the board of directors of a bunch of aircraft companies. They won't let him do anything. Henry Ford gives him a job. So that's one of the criticisms of Lindbergh, is that he was friendly with Henry Ford, and Henry Ford was an anti-Semite, and that's true. But he was also friendly with Jews. So I don't really care who his friends are. Henry Ford gives him a job as a test pilot. So the most famous pilot in American history is working as a test pilot. He does research on high-altitude aviation. He does research on oxygen supplies. He designs the cockpit of the B-24, the oxygen equipment in the cockpit of the B-24. In 1944, he goes to fight the Japanese, develops new throttle settings for the P-47, which increases its range 200 miles, and enables MacArthur to attack Palau, which is the battle was in Peleliu earlier. Comes back from the war. 1945, Roosevelt's dead. The Air Force invites him to go back to Europe. He goes back to Europe. He sees a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp and recruits engineers, not just for rockets, but also for jet engines. We did not have a working jet engine at the end of World War II. The Germans do. Mm-hmm. They're way ahead of us in terms of not just the wings and the engines, but also the armaments and a lot of the engineering aspects of jet engines which they were way ahead of us because they had working jet fighter planes and we didn't.
Well, and they had a need. They needed something to
Yeah.
give them the edge over the fact that we could just produce, hey, we built this plane 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, we
right?
can build thousands of them, and we
Yeah.
had all the fuel we needed. So the Korea starts in 1950, and that's only 5 years. And if any of you have ever worked in aerospace engineering, you know that's a very short time to develop an airplane.
Just enough time to lose most of our army.
Right.
Our military.
So we do have a jet end. We do the P-80C when the Korean War begins, and Lindbergh gets a lot of credit for that too. For the he was a test pilot for jet fighter planes. He worked with a lot of these German engineers that he recruited from Germany. He tried to recruit Messerschmitt. Messerschmitt was hiding in a barn in May 1945, and Lindbergh finds him hiding in a barn and brings a German translator with him. Tries to get Messerschmitt to come to the United States, but he won't leave Germany. So that's what he does after the war. In 1954, he gets promoted to brigadier general by Eisenhower. And he also wins the Pulitzer Prize, which is remarkable. The man won the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Pulitzer Prize. There's only 2 people in history that have ever done that. And he's the only one who did it when he was alive. The other guy did it posthumously. So that's pretty much where my book ends in 1955.
Well, he's an amazing person, right? Obviously through and through. And he's very intellectual. And you're absolutely right about, one thing too people forget about all the way, we ended World War II with the largest army we've ever had. 12, and I'm going to talk just the Army Air Corps, right?
Yeah.
But it was 12 million people, 13 million people. Where you're right, at the beginning of the war, we had about 100,000 and guys were running around with brooms.
Yes.
Remember? Yes, they were running around with brooms in these exercises, right? And you got 12 million people. Then we just dump most of the military, right? Almost everybody out. And then what do you get 5 years later? Task Force Smith.
Yeah.
And people forget about the Korea itself is truly the forgotten war. We all think about World War II. We all remember Vietnam, but Korea was an amazing conflict of just horrible. And the fact of how we came back from it. But yeah, people like Charles Lindbergh, it's, he's iconic, from everything from just doing, you think about it, the transatlantic flight all the way to, there was nothing he didn't, I don't think that guy feared anything.
So there were isolationists before Lindbergh. There
Absolutely.
was Senator Gerald Nye and Senator William Borah. The difference between them and Lindbergh was that Lindbergh wanted to be prepared for World War II. He got money allocated to build a munitions industry. His argument wasn't that munitions cause war, which was a fallacy throughout the 1930s. In France, in England, the United States, people believed if we don't build weapons, we will not enter a war.
Right.
Which, of course, is a disaster. Lindbergh said, build the weapons, build the right weapons. Don't just build weapons, build the ones you're going to need and keep them. Keep them to defend yourself. Don't send them to England. Don't send them to France. Don't send them to Russia. Keep them. And he gets credit for a number of allocations for military resources, even though he held no political office, because his intelligence was used to justify allocating money, because he met with something called NACA, which was the precursor of NASA, to get money for rockets. He gets a lot of credit for allocation of money. You're saying they only had brooms. We didn't have tanks. We had buses with the word tank written on them in the 1930s. He got a lot of money allocated to the military so that situation could be rectified, so that we could be ready to fight World War II. Unfortunately, we weren't, because we'd given so many weapons to England and so many weapons to the Soviet Union. And that was Lindbergh's bugaboo, that we were giving our weapons away. Not that we were building them, but that we were giving them away.
Well, and it's in that doctrine is what we do today. Absolutely what we do. We don't have the strongest military in the world because we want to use the strongest military in the world. We have the strongest military in the world because no one will challenge it, right? No one in their right mind. There's a lot of people outside their right mind that do things. But, I would say his doctrine was absolutely correct. And we don't do that now. We don't give things to our allies, even like the F-22 fighter has never been exported. And it's the most, we talk about the F-35, it's all over the news, but the F-22 is still the most superior dominant airplane on the planet today. We've given it to no one. And for that exact reason alone. But Charles Lindbergh, absolutely iconic. I mean, from everything he did, and your book is fantastic. So I will put in the comments down here a link to the book. What would you like to say as a closing out before we?
Convenientvillain.com is the website. You can email me at convenientvillain@gmail.com if you have any questions about Lindbergh. It's trite to say people are complicated. It's trite to say that people say that all the time. But you have to be very careful when you think about history that you don't simplify people into caricatures.
It's true.
The 100th anniversary of Lindbergh's flight is coming up, May 21st, 2027. You're going to read a lot of stuff about Lindbergh. A lot of it's going to be bad. Keep in the back of your mind that a lot of it isn't true. Historians have not been accurate talking about Lindbergh. And there's a chapter in my book called The Apocrypha, where I talk about these stories about him, which are apocryphal, the things he didn't do, misquotes, quotes taken out of context, sentences started in the middle, sentences cut off in the middle of the sentence. And the lesson is, if you were truly evil, you wouldn't need to do that. The counterexample is George Wallace, not Henry Wallace, the vice president, but George Wallace, the governor of Alabama in the 1960s. On January 1963, he was being inaugurated as governor of Alabama, and he said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That's it. You don't need to lie about him. You don't need to pull something out of his journal. It's right there. He said it in front of all the journalists. If somebody were truly an anti-Semite, if somebody were truly a racist, if somebody were truly a eugenicist, which is another argument I get, you wouldn't have to manipulate his quotes or take things out of his journal. I mean, have you read Harry Truman's journal? You've seen the awful things that Harry Truman wrote in history. People write things in their journal. It's their private thoughts. If that's what you're reading to establish his legacy, they have nothing else. They have no quote that they can use, so they're pulling something out of his private journal that nobody was intended to read. So keep in the back of your mind, it's probably not accurate. This man was not perfect. He wasn't even a nice man. But he is entitled to be judged on his true historical record, not somebody else's opinion of what it was. And that's what I tried to do in my book. I didn't try to be nice to him or bend over backwards for him. I just tried to be fair and tell the story the way I understand it as a Jewish American, as a former aerospace engineer, as a cardiologist. This is what I understand his legacy to have been. If you don't agree with me, write me. He's not related to me. I don't care. Say whatever you want about him. He's not my grandfather. If you don't like him, fine. You think he was an anti-Semite, fine. I don't take it personally. I'm just trying to tell the truth because I don't think anybody else was going to do it.
I think, judging people by what they do, not by what people say about them, should be the gold standard for anything in American politics. It never will be, obviously, right? We don't learn that lesson. Every generation never learns that lesson until it's too late. But, obviously what he did was amazing, right? We would be worse off. Would we have won World War II? Probably, I'm sure, right?
Later.
We
would have won it later.
Later, exactly.
And that means fewer Holocaust survivors. And it means that the Germans introduced jet engines and ballistic missiles in greater numbers with greater accuracy. And remember, these weapons will render every weapon in World War II obsolete. These weapons will. And if the Germans are on the verge of introducing them into warfare, who knows what would have happened if the war lasted another 6 months or a year. We have no idea what would have happened.
Years. Yeah, who knows, right? But my guess would have been years, just because American public opinion was, we're winning the war, we're winning the war, we're winning the war. If you'd have set us back, right, that would have been the problem. That's the American public problem about any kind of war. We're all for it when we're winning, but as soon as we take some setbacks, it's like, are we really supposed to be there? And then you have a lot of problems. We never had that in World War II because we won constantly after the beginning of the war, right? But no, that's amazing. And thanks for coming on today.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
It was awesome. I learned so much about him today, and I didn't even know. I honestly didn't know. And there's just so many other things we could have gotten into, and I apologize we didn't get a chance to it. Like, I didn't even know about the medical research. That was fantastic for me to think about it, and that someone at the time, he was so, just ingenious about everything, right? I mean, look at all the work he did just to get across the Atlantic, all the way up until, like you said, with the engines and the medical researchers and the throttle settings. And
the most famous man in the world could be in Hollywood dating Hollywood stars. He could be doing advertisements. Instead, he's sitting in a lab by himself, tinkering with a device to improve medical care. And, historians don't want to take that at face value, because somehow or another it impugns their argument. Well, why couldn't he have done something good and something bad in his lifetime? Why would you diminish a medical achievement? It makes no sense to me as a physician. But this is the legacy of Charles Lindbergh.
And no one's perfect, but there are always people
one's
who want to write about people, tear them down because they don't want to do the research like you did.
Yes,
right?
thank you.
And honest criticism is exactly what we should be doing. That's academic, right? That's professional, not sensationalism, which I'm sure at the time and nowadays, of course. And you're right. So May 21st, we'll probably see some of that. So hopefully we did some good to dispel it here today. So
thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And everybody, again, thanks for watching another episode of Living History. If you get a chance, please click like and subscribe. And everybody have a great day. And thanks again, Dr. Rich.
Bye-bye.